for International Economics and former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy, Director of Madras School of Economics, and Professor Suresh Babu, Director of MIDS, will be moderating the session, and to whom I'd like to hand over the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna, and once again a warm welcome for this discussion on the state of the economy and budget. Well, I am not going to take much time because very distinguished speakers are there to talk about the economy and on the budget proposals. The event is as follows. We will have a release of this report, the state of the economy, which is actually prepared by MIDS, Abhishek, who was in charge of that. And then Abhishek will make a presentation on the state of the economy, and two of our distinguished panelists, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam and Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy, will offer comments on the budget and the state of the economy. So may I now request Dr. Arvind Subramaniam to release this report and hand over the first copy to Dr. Bhanumurthy. May I now request Abhishek to make his presentation on the state of the economy? Abhishek? Yeah, is it? Would you like to sit there so that?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So what I'm going to do here is just try and bring out the key messages that we have in the report, and I'll try and keep it very brief because we have much more interesting things to talk about after this. So the report as such is titled Breaking the Cycle, Reviving Growth Amid Structural and Cyclical Challenges. I think all of us know that the economy is going through some trouble. We talk a lot about recent slowdown last couple of quarters, but is it only recent phenomena or does it date back to longer? That's what we try and discuss in the paper, the report. And the key message is that perhaps it dates back longer, even prior to the pandemic. The slowdown was already there. So in a way, it's not just cyclical, but there is something structural going on. And then we just try and look at what possible factors are there which explains this and what can be done to revive the growth. So I already have discussed the structure of the report. So we begin with just looking at what happened this particular year, financial year, the first 2 quarters, just reviewing different sectors of the economy. And this is what all of you are aware that, last 2 quarters, there was a huge slowdown, much more than what everyone expected. And the latest quarter, the growth number was 5.4%. If you look at the real GDP numbers, the lowest in last 7 quarters. And even prior to that, the previous quarter, it wasn't a number which everyone expected it to be. And overall, for the first half of this fiscal year, the growth is around 6%. Whereas when we started, the initial forecast that came out just before the start of the financial year, it was supposed to be around 7%. So we are well below that number. And that's why the question that what is happening, is it something cyclical or structural? Again, the slowdown is broad-based. It's not just 1 or 2 sectors. So most of the sectors, whether it is manufacturing, investment, government spending, you do see the weakness. Even services, which most of the time has been doing better than other sectors, is slowing down, except for consumption, where you get a mixed signal, which is kind of counterintuitive because you look at all the media reports that's coming out, the latest budget, the focus has been on reviving consumption. But if you look at the official numbers, in fact, consumption is doing better than most of the indicators. And we will look into some of these issues, why that is the case. Again, once the numbers were out for the first 2 quarters, there was a downward revision. And just look across any agency and the numbers have come down significantly. So I think before the start of the fiscal year, the consensus number was around 6.4%. Around 7%. It's almost 50-60 basis points down related to that. And now we stand at around 6.4% for the financial year as a whole. And NSO itself is estimating a growth number of around 6.4%, whereas RBI is projecting a number of around 6.6%. But all these numbers are well below what initially it was thought out to be, close to around 50 to 60 basis points for most of these agencies. However, if you look at Q3, everyone thought that maybe Q1, Q2, and things are coming back to normal in Q3. But this is not the sense that you get when you look at the high frequency indicators. And it looks like most of the indicators are doing less than, not as good as what we initially thought. And economy definitely doesn't look like that is picking up even in Q3. So, if this trend continues, not enough policy supports are there, it is likely that the growth would be maybe low. So if you look at the range that we saw earlier, it ranges from around 6 to 6.6% for different agencies now, and it is likely that it would fall below maybe even 6.4%, closer to maybe around 6.2, 6.3% number. Now what is troubling is that the slowdown that we see in India, you don't see that most of the other major economies. So one can understand if it is a global phenomena, and in other parts as well, there is a similar phenomena, slowdown happening, but you don't get that sense if you look at other countries. So this is what we see here is the projection based on IMF's latest World Economic Outlook report. And we compare here the projections that they had for different parts of the economy in October 2024 report vis-a-vis what they have in their latest report that was released in January 2025. And what you see for most of the other economies, somewhere close to what was projected at the beginning of the financial year and also in October 2024, except for India, where there is, it's almost 50 basis points below of what IMF had projected in October 2024 report. So India is in a way decoupling from rest of the world. So of course, global phenomena are not as easy, but things haven't really deteriorated from last 1 year, and it was all expected. And on that basis, India was expected to grow at around 7%, but you see it's doing much below that number that we initially projected. So while economy is slowing down, if you look at the inflation number, and we are showing, what we show here is CPI-based inflation, it's pretty sticky. It was almost around 5.6% last year, and till now, it has averaged around 5.5, so well above 4% target that RBI has. And of course, it is driven mainly by food inflation, which has been very volatile, and the 70% of the inflation is explained by just CPI food. And you see at core inflation, which is around 3.4%, so which in a way gives us a sense that again, the economy is losing momentum because that gets reflected in core inflation numbers. And now increasingly, specifically post-September, you see the spillover from real economy is now getting reflected also in the market. And you see the stock markets here post-September, they reached historical highs in September, and since then they have shedded more than 10%. In fact, it continues to drop even as we speak. And same thing when you look at the FPI outflows number. And post-September, there has been an outflow of more than $20 to $23 billion now. So you do get a sense that the market is also getting jittery, and it's not just the real economy, it is getting translated also to the market numbers as well. However, one peculiar aspect is while you see the equity market, shed a huge correction in equity market, you don't see that in the bond market. And in fact, the yield it has come down quite a bit. And in fact, while the US yield, it has been going up, it is coming down in India. And it's clearly visible post-September 2024. I'm not sure what possible reasons could be there, but one big part of the reason is that India got included in the GPI Morgan Index this particular year. So once you get included in the market, then what really happens is that whatever the asset under management of JP Morgan is, certain part of that would automatically come to India. And so you get for 1 year, you get that advantage because you have just been included. So no matter what happens, every year you will get some inflow. And it's only after 1 year, when things have totally materialized, you would perhaps see, what you see in the equity market getting reflected in bond market as well. So for some reason, and this is partly the reason, you see bond market behaving differently from the equity market. So now what we try and do is just discuss whether the slowdown that we see in last 2 quarters, is it something temporary and we don't have to worry much about, or is it structural, in which case some policy corrections have to be undertaken. And so what becomes important here is not to look just at real growth numbers, but also to look at nominal growth numbers, because they tell a very different story. Because if you look at real growth numbers, yes, growth has been low in last 2 quarters, but before that it was doing pretty well. So even if you include last 2 growth numbers over a period of, I think, 12 quarters, 10 to 12 quarters, the growth has been close to around 7.5%. So it looks like the economy is doing pretty well. It's just a matter of last 2 quarters. So maybe it's just a temporary issue. But if you look at the nominal numbers, it tells you a different story. I think there was a temporary boom post-pandemic because of the pent-up demand. But since then, at least the nominal numbers have come down sharply. And for the same quarters for which the real number averages 7%, the nominal numbers would average around 9%. And in fact, in all the quarters except for one, the nominal growth numbers were less than 10%. And that basically tells that the slowdown is not just cyclical, but there is something structural there which needs to be discussed. So basically, at least this is how I would conclude, that it looks like there are deeper structural issues, and the cyclical factors that we have seen, and we will discuss that soon, has only kind of complicated, and the sharp slowdown that we see getting reflected in real number are because of perhaps cyclical factors, but the structural issues have always been there. Now the one thing why we see this difference in nominal and real, and it has been often talked about, are, and it's well known, the measurement issues that are there when it comes to measuring the GDP numbers, and we'll discuss it briefly. So very simply, what we do, we calculate nominal numbers first. So 70%, almost 70% of the economy is first calculated in nominal basis, and then we convert it into real number. And of course, we use different deflators for that. And now there are issues when it comes to using the different deflators that we have, and a lot of people have spoken about it. The main issue is that of single deflation, where what we do is basically we do not deflate separately the output and input, which happens in most other advanced economies, and increasingly most of the developing countries also are going for double deflation. What we do is inputs are deflated using different indicators, more relevant to the inputs, and outputs are deflated differently. Now what happens, when your input and output prices are behaving differently, and you can see that in the WPI and CPI numbers here. WPI is kind of more reflective of input prices, and CPI numbers are more reflective of output prices. And what you see is that WPI prices have come down quite a bit, whereas CPI prices have been sticky. Whereas for many of the output that are there in GVA, we deflate it using WPI. And in fact, most of these services, again, is deflated by using WPI. So because of this particular reason, what really happens if WPI, CPI prices are diverging, there are high chances that we would overestimate growth. And of course, it would be the reverse. If CPI is high, but CPI is low, but WPI is high, we would underestimate growth. But here, what is happening in India right now, WPI, CPI are diverging, WPI is pretty low, CPI is still sticky. So chances are high that we would overestimate growth. That's why maybe we do not see, we saw the real numbers earlier, it looks healthy, partly because of the measurement issues. But if you correct for that, perhaps the story that comes out, if you look at real GDP numbers, would be consistent with the nominal GDP numbers. So now we look at, what are the cyclical factors in the first 2 quarters. And first is the fiscal consolidation. So of course, this was an year of election. So May was election, before that model code of conduct, and after that again there were state elections in Maharashtra, Jharkhand. So of course the capex cycle, I mean government could not have spent money on all the capex projects it had. So that led to huge consolidation, and what you see here in 24-25 first half, the fiscal deficit number, it contracted by almost 200 basis points. Now that's a huge consolidation, I would say. But can we say that it is all because of election? I mean, you look at past 2 election cycles, same time period, and you see that during those 2 election cycles, the consolidation was much lesser, 50 basis points in 2014-15 and 20 basis points in 19-20. Whereas in 24-25, 200 basis points. So, I mean, I don't think it has to do only with this being an election year. Of course, I mean, there were state elections as well, which was perhaps not the case, but maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe, you know, government was late in reacting once the elections were over to re-kick the capex cycle. The second thing, and I mean, Arvind will talk about it maybe in more detail. He has written extensively about it, but we know that there was also a huge monetary contraction that happened. I mean, we might not have increased the rate, but effectively, there was a huge liquidity tightening that happened, and primarily because RBI was perhaps trying to not let the rupee move beyond certain band. They were perhaps targeting a particular number, and you see that flat line, you know, starting from maybe late 2022, early 2023, there was virtually no movement in the rupee. But the way for RBI to do it was to sell a lot of dollars in the market and buy rupee. But when you do that, while you manage the volatility and you manage to effectively peg the currency, but then you are sucking out liquidity from the market. And that is exactly what happened. And then you see that getting reflected in the banking system as well. And these are here, what we show here is basically the liquidity, how it was mostly in deficit zone, and much, much lesser than RBI's own target of maintaining a 1% of NDTL, net time demand liability. That's what the RBI targets, that should be the surplus in the system, but it was in deficit for most time. And you see that getting reflected in short-term interest rates as well. As deficits, there was liquidity deficit, the short-term market also, and the repo rate that you see, the interbanking overnight rate, it was mostly above the repo rate. RBI usually tries and maintain it below the repo rate and now the SDF rate, but you would see how frequently it has overshot RBI's repo rate. So those were the cyclical factors which perhaps explain the simultaneous tightening of the monetary as well as fiscal consolidation that we see in the first 2 quarters that has led to a sharp slowdown in the first 2 quarters. But as we discussed earlier, I mean, it doesn't look like that the situation, it's not that it is only cyclical. And if you remember, even prior to the pandemic, the economy was slowing down. In fact, 2019-20, the growth rate was somewhere around 3.5, 3.9, which was a multi-year low. So economy was already slowing down. And, it kind of starts from maybe 2008-9, once we were hit by the global financial crisis, and of course, post that because of banking crisis that followed and private investment collapse, it came down by 10. So even today, our private investment is 10 basis points lower than what it used to be pre-GFC as a ratio of GDP. And of course, our exports also collapsed after that. So the economy was already, these 2 major engines of growth, they were collapsing. But we could still sustain for some time period because of consumption, but over time even consumption weakened. And by the time it was 2019-20, the growth rate came down slowly to around 4%, which was a multi-year low. Post-pandemic, of course, because of once the economy restarted again because of pent-up demand, it kind of temporarily supported the economy. But even now, as demand kind of normalizes, the momentum is phasing down, and we are again back to the low growth rate that we were seeing prior to the pandemic. And in such a situation where consumption is already low, investment was anyway already low, there's very little incentive for firms to invest in new capacity because they don't see, that the consumption is there, the demand is there for them. So we are in a way stuck in a way this loop of low investment, low demand, and it's hard to break that cycle. But what we try and propose here that maybe one of the reasons why we are in this situation and what can be done to break this cycle. I'll not go through the short-term fixes because I think most of this have been already addressed. RBI is already, they have been trying to infuse liquidity in the market. Repo rate cut just few days back, CRR cut, bond purchases. So they're trying to infuse liquidity. Center is also, although till November you don't see it in the numbers, but I think December there is some pickup in capex cycle. So, and also the latest budget where they have significantly reduced the income tax rate. So, the short term, whatever the government can do, the RBI can do, I think they are doing it. But what would be important going forward is for RBI to not to target any certain level of exchange rate, because once you start doing it, no matter how much money you infuse, you will again be in a situation where liquidity is in deficit. Now, what we feel is that, when you are in this loop of low demand and low investment, what should be done, one of the ways to get out of this loop is that while your domestic demand is low, we should try and cater to foreign demand. One question could be, in this world where, a lot of tariffs being raised, deglobalizing world, is it feasible for a country like India? And we feel that there are 3 reasons why it is still a viable option. So one, if you look at India's global share in overall manufacturing exports, it's very low. It's even less than 2%. And, other emerging economies much smaller than India, they do much better. So even in a deglobalization work, if you can just capture some market share, I think that can really solve part of the problem. So despite deglobalization, I think India stands to gain just by capturing, because we are punching way below our weight. It's a very small market share that we have, and even if we increase this 2% to say 5%, there's a lot of gains to be made for a country like India. That's number one. Number two, increasingly, we all are aware that things are changing in China. Number one, of course, China has become much richer, so the per capita income there is higher. So it's not going to be as competitive as it used to be earlier to produce low labor-intensive commodities, say such as apparel or textile. And we do see those in numbers that China is vacating that space. And that's where maybe India can stand to gain, and it can try and capture some of that market space. And third, increasingly, we know that now US is going to impose a lot of tariffs on China. In fact, it has already started. So Chinese goods, Chinese exports to US will become more expensive. Again, emerging economies, including India, they tend to benefit from this particular tariff war, which is going to, most likely will happen. But India hasn't really made much progress so far. And you see here in the numbers that post 2015, our global export share is virtually stagnant. It hasn't really grown. But you see that, the same world, where deglobalization is happening, Vietnam has managed to do pretty well. And if you look at just the apparel export share, and you see how China is vacating space, but India hasn't managed to gain anything out of it. In fact, India's share has further declined, whereas countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh, they have captured most of the space, but India hasn't managed to do well. So while opportunities are there, and you do see that other countries are gaining, we don't see India making any progress. So the question, of course, is why? And we feel there are 2 particular reasons. The first being the change in our own trade policy. We have become more protectionist, and you see here in the import tariff numbers, specifically post 2016, in 2017 there was a huge hike in the tariff numbers, and specifically in low skill. That's where our comparative advantage is. But you see that import tariffs have been hiked quite a bit. Now the problem is that the hike, it's not just on the final output. Many of the hikes have happened in commodities which are used as input in manufacturing these goods. So what you see here is that even intermediate input, the hike has been around close to 10 to 11 percentage points. So our goods have become more expensive to manufacture, so you are not able to compete with other global players. That's part of the reason. Now, the good news is that, last 1 to 2 years, it looks like government has realized that it has perhaps not worked. And you would see, huge cut across the board on tariff rates. It is still higher than what it used to be earlier, but at least we are moving in the right direction. And again, you would see the reduction is in fact much higher in case of intermediate input. So this is good, this should help, but I think this should come down even further. I guess even in the latest budget, they have further rationalized it. So perhaps it is lower than what we see here. However, the bad part is while, on the import tariff part, we have rationalized, but we have erected many non-tariff barriers. And I would just like to give one example. In the case of VSF is viscose, which is one of the key input that goes into manufacturing apparel. So good thing is that we removed anti-dumping. Then we also reduced import tariff, and you do see how the import for VSF, if it kind of picks up. But then in around June 23, we introduced what we call QCO is basically quality control measure. So basically any country, any company based out of India who wants to export their products to India, they have to get a license from BIS, the Indian organization. And most of the time, just because BIS, they don't have the capacity because there's so many companies looking to get certified. So and they have to physically go and visit the manufacturing site and certify. So most of these companies, they end up not getting the certificate that they need. And in some cases, specifically in VSF, what you see is that it's also very maybe strategic, or I don't know why it is happening. You would see for VSF, most of the countries, they have been given the certificate. But countries that matter for Indian manufacturers, in this case Indonesia, because most of our imports come from Indonesia, except for Indonesian firms, all others have been given QCO, but not Indonesian firms. And you would see how, since the introduction of QCO, it has collapsed. So I'm showing you one particular sector here, but this is almost every sector now, where a lot of, more than 800, close to 800 QCOs which have been issued. And that's really hampering the sector. The second thing is private investment is low, and earlier we used to attract a lot of FDI, which used to help and compensate for low private investment, at least private domestic investment. And you see how over time, post 2008, it has come down, and last 2 to 3 years, there's a sharp slowdown. The amount of FDI, even in absolute values that we attract, is declining, and now it's less than 1% as a ratio of our GDP. Now, of course, one can claim that this is a global phenomena, high interest rates in the US, so a lot of capital moving back to US, and that's why maybe India is suffering, but so are other countries, and we are not really an outlier. But then if you just look at India's share in global FDI, so it's not just as a share of GDP, but even as a global share of FDI, it is declining. Even if you exclude China and look at all other countries, India's share has come down quite a bit. So it's not simply global factors. Maybe that can partly explain, but it has a lot to do with our own domestic policies as well. The business environment is perhaps not as stable as companies would like to see. And you see that getting reflected, and we're not attracting as much FDI as we used to earlier. So yeah, just briefly to conclude, India is slowing down. It doesn't look like that it is cyclical because it dates back even pre-pandemic. So it looks like a combination of structural plus cyclical. It is easy to fix the cyclical issue. We have a tight monetary and fiscal conditions right now. I think government has already made changes. RBI is also doing its bit, which should help. But that's not a solution that can maybe help us grow for another maybe quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters. But for growth to be sustainable, it is a structural challenge that matters. And while there are many structural issues, land, labor, and whatnot, but despite that, we could do better post 2000. But there's something new which is happening, which is India becoming protectionist, and also the business environment not being as stable. A lot of policy flip-flops, so you're losing confidence of investors, so we are also not attracting as much FDI as we should. And that's where, the challenge is, and that's what government has to do. I think they do realize that trade policy hasn't worked, but we do see only in case of import tariffs being eliminated, but you are erasing other barriers. I think it would help if they can also kind of get away, all the QCOs and other non-tariff barriers which are there. They should try and eliminate that. And most importantly, of course, investors feel that perhaps conditions are not conducive for them to do businesses here in India. And you do see getting that reflected in the FDI numbers, and government will have to do heavy lifting there, policy stability, making sure that investors feel that things will not change once they invest in India. Those are some of the hard policy challenges, but unless we don't do that, it's hard that we can grow sustainably. These structural issues, the cyclical things maybe 1-2 quarters, but finally it is about dealing with those issues for us to be able to grow on a sustainable basis. So yeah, that's the report. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Abhishek, for this very clear and elaborate presentation on the state of the economy. So that actually concludes the first part, that is the backdrop with which we saw the budget on February 1st. Now we move on to the second part, that is against this backdrop, we heard the budget, new proposals, a lot of new initiatives. Now we request our distinguished panelists to reflect on the budget and its possible impact. I would like to add a couple of things to what Abhishek was, presenting. In the context of the budget, it comes in the backdrop of a growth slowdown, and that's what we saw in terms of the numbers. B, it also comes at a time when the gross savings in the economy is not increasing very high. So I think that is something which we will have to again worry about at some point. See, we also find that the corporate earnings are not growing as fast as we thought, though economic survey talks about the distribution and the wage growth and things of that sort. The rate of growth of corporate earnings has not been very high, especially in some of the quarters which Abhishek was talking. And four, finally, we also find that household debt is increasing slightly, if not at an alarming rate compared to some of the other developing economies. We find that there is a very slow but a steady increase in terms of the household debt. Now, against this backdrop, we find concessions, we find measures to boost consumption, stimulate consumption and economic activity in the budget. So, may I now request Dr. Aravind Subramaniam to offer his comments on the budget. Yes.
Thanks, Suresh. How much time do you think? Okay, not too long. And first of all, I want to thank Suresh and MIDS for hosting this event. I think it's very timely. I also want to recommend very strongly that people should carefully go over this report that Abhishek and MIDS have presented. It's really a wonderful overview of where we stand today. So I'm only going to add a few things to what Abhishek and Suresh just raised. I want to separate this, at least my presentation, into two components. The budget and one or two small things I want to add, but also to take stock of where we are, where the Indian economy is, especially I think at a time when the global economy is, I think, not least because of the new man in the White House. I mean, the global environment is really being churned in very unpredictable and probably damaging ways for the world economy. And I think how India is going to navigate this is going to become a big challenge. I think so. I want to touch upon that as well. I think as far as the budget is concerned, I don't have very strong views about whether it was good or bad. I think it is like many budgets, except to say that I think the budget made the assumption that what we're witnessing is a cyclical slowdown, and therefore you need to provide these big tax cuts, which were quite expensive tax cuts. 1 lakh crores, I think, is the number, right? It's a pretty big number in tax cuts. Maybe the old Swaraja party may have been very happy with Swatantra party, and Rajaji might have been very happy with this at some level. People have views on that, and I want to say, so that was kind of the big part of the budget. And if you think that the assessment, like what Abhishek had, is that the slowdown is much more structural than cyclical, then maybe this might help at the margin. Maybe not. I don't have a very strong view either way. But it's not certainly not going to address the structural problem that Abhishek has so nicely identified. I mean, on the budget itself, let me say 3 things. One, on the tax cuts, yes, it may or may not stimulate the economy, but this is part of a steady trend that's been happening in India over the last many years, where it's somehow becoming more and more important to take more and more income taxpayers out of the tax net. We saw this in 2019, we've seen this again and again. So just to think about this, just to give you a number, Devesh Kapoor and I are writing a book, and where you will see these numbers. Something like the share of taxpayers to the working age population is, of course, amongst the lowest in the world, but it's something like 5-6%. So very few people pay taxes in India, and now the trend is fewer and fewer people will pay taxes. And I don't think it's a good development, because I think the whole object of economic development is, when you want to build good institutions in society, the tax system is in fact a critical part of the glue that binds citizens and taxpayers, that binds taxpayers and the government. And the more you take people out of the tax net, the more damaging it is for long-run development of institutions. But leaving that aside, I think what is to me interesting about the tax cuts is, why is it that it is now almost, politicians feel under pressure to respond to this? Or in other words, why is the claim of, by the way, none of this, it's touted as a middle-class tax cut. It is nothing but, not even close to middle class, because these are all people who are in the top 7, 8, 9, 10% of the income spectrum. So this is not middle class by any stretch of the term. But why is it that politicians feel compelled to respond to this? Or in other words, why is the claim of this very, very rich group, maybe not the very, 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 very rich group, but it's still a very, very rich group, what is it that the claims of these people to say, cut our taxes, why does it command legitimacy? And people think that it's not a bad thing to do. And I don't have a very good answer to that, but it seems to me that it commands legitimacy for 2 reasons. One is that, the tax-paying class probably feels that, because so few of us pay taxes, what are we getting in return for the taxes that we pay? So in some sense, if government delivery of services is not very good, then they say this is not a good deal for us. And therefore, this, so it speaks, so that's why I don't want to take a strong view on whether it's kind of good or bad, but it's just, it does seem to reflect something deeper, and that something deeper is kind of a general disappointment or disenchantment with the ability of government to provide services. I think a second reason which I feel has become more salient in the last, I would say, 5 years, is that, for those of you, all of you follow this whole debate on Revadis in India, right? The giveaways, as it were. And again, I don't have a strong view, we can discuss this. But the sense that taxpayers feel that, I am paying taxes, but this is going away as redistribution to the quote unquote the undeserving or others, is another reason why they probably feel, why should we pay taxes? So there is something deeper going on here, and I think we should be aware of it when we evaluate things like tax cuts. Indira Rajaraman had a wonderful insight about the history of how the tax systems develop over time, and her observation was that if you look at how tax systems, fiscal systems have developed over time, the income taxes and tax as a redistributive tool comes much later in the development process, only after the state has provided essential public goods that everyone benefits from. So the legitimacy of redistribution is acquired by the state providing essential goods and services for everyone. And here, in some ways, if you don't provide those essential goods and services, then the redistribution thing gets called into question, and that's why taxpayers say, why should we pay taxes and so on. So I think it's just something that is worth keeping in mind when we think about these tax cuts. The second point I want to make is a very narrow, self-serving point, something that the only thing that maybe Abhishek missed. So in the budget, there's something they've, in a sense, slightly changed the fiscal framework, as it were. For the last 20 years, the fiscal framework has broadly targeted fiscal deficits. For the first time, I think the government has said we should target a declining debt trajectory, right? And I'm sorry for sounding very vain and self-referential, but this was exactly what I recommended in 2017. There was an encasing FRBM committee report, and I wrote a strong dissent from that note, saying that all these deficit targets are all very arbitrary. What we should have is a gently declining debt trajectory, which is what they've done. But what is missing in that is that it's one thing to have a fiscal objective, which is a declining debt, but you still need some operational benchmarks to be consistent with achieving that declining debt trajectory. That's missing in the budget, and I think that's something maybe that the government could work towards. So the third thing I will say about the short term is something that Abhishek touched upon. I think part of the slowdown was cyclical, definitely, and part of that was because of RBI's policies. I don't want to sound like a stuck record, but I think between 2022 and January of 2025, about 2.5 years, I think the RBI followed a highly unfortunate exchange rate policy. It was very unfortunate. It was very costly for the economy. And sadly, it went unnoticed and below the radar screen. Even today, I think there are not many people who would say that the RBI's policies of the last 2.5 years. I think since January, as Abhishek quite rightly said, things have changed in the right direction. But it was a very unfortunate 2.5 years of exchange rate policy, which inflicted a lot of damage to the economy. I think we need much more discussion of that. We need much more discussion of how we can have guardrails against this eminent institution which can follow inappropriate policies. What are the guardrails? What are the accountability mechanisms? But I think it was very unfortunate, and I hope that policy has changed. Now, I want to turn now to the longer term issues and what's happening in the world. So, and Abhishek alluded to this, after the global financial crisis, there was a real opportunity created for countries like India. Because China was becoming richer, so all the things that it was doing very competitively, it ceased to be competitive, And so we thought part of that, when it starts becoming uncompetitive, the countries that would take up that slack, one of those would be India. So this was what was called the China Plus One opportunity. So of course, India did not take advantage of that. That China Plus One opportunity was reinforced when Trump first came to power, because in addition to a natural economic logic of things moving away from China, there was a political opportunity, geopolitical opportunity created, because President Trump came and said, sorry, I'm not going to allow China to export its way out of trouble and inflict all these damage on us. Now, when that happened, and that's started maybe 17, 18, we thought another opportunity for India, but that too, I think, has gone largely unexploited, I think. Of course, now there's a third opportunity that's arisen for India, and I think I've been very excited about this opportunity for India for two reasons. One is a very parochial Tamil Nadu reason, because a lot of this opportunity, probably the only state in India which is kind of taking advantage of this opportunity is Tamil Nadu. And we can talk about that later. But the second reason I was excited about this was because it offered, after many, many years, a chance for India to start doing manufacturing efficiently, as Abhishek showed. India has about 2 to 3% of the global market share in exports, and if you extended it to labor-intensive exports, India's share is 4%, China's share at its peak was 40%. So India was massively underperforming on manufacturing, so I thought this would create this opportunity. But I think now, with this third opportunity that's come, with President Trump probably going to go against China, so on the one hand, that opportunity has been reinforced, but I think that it's become more complicated now, because President Trump is not only going to hit China with tariffs, he's going to hit everyone with tariffs. And India is a target, because if you look at barriers against American exports in the world, trade barriers, I saw a chart yesterday. Korea is the highest, India is the second highest. So in India, it's going to happen. He's going to impose tariffs on India. And so the China Plus One opportunity, which was real, has now become slightly more complicated and obscured, because we ourselves are going to be, and as Trump, the Biden mantra was friend-shoring, not on-shoring. That is, not away from China, it can come to, all the investment can flow to any of the friends, but Trump comes along and says, no, all this has to come back to the US. We only want manufacturing in the US. If it comes to India, I will hit tariffs on India as well. So it's going to be a much more, the waters are going to be much more muddied as a result of that. So I think that in this context, the question is, what does India do? What does India do? We need manufacturing to create employment. We can't just survive on services, because, no matter how much services you do, you're going to employ 2, 3, 4% of the labor force, which is, not going to give us inclusive growth. So I think it's a real challenge for us. And I would say, the question I'm asked is, I did a couple of recent interviews with Martin Wolf of the Financial Times and Karan Thapar. Do we think that this government has the mindset, the ability, the instincts, the DNA to kind of, take advantage or to see the global environment as it is and take advantage of it? I think, to be fair to the government, I don't think they're unaware of the fact that this is a structural thing, because they've been also obsessing about why has private investment not picked up, why is FDI coming down. So I think, to be fair to them, they understand this problem. But I think that their sense of what needs to be done is not quite where their instincts are. And let me give you 2 or 3 examples of this. Uh, so if someone asks you, why is private investment in India so weak? I think, there are many, many explanations for this. But I would kind of put it this way. Josh Feldman and I, Abhishek and I have written about this. See, when you think about investors, about private investment, especially when investors have to make a manufacturing investment, which is a long commitment, right? So you want to make sure that over the course of this investment, which would be 20, 25, 30 years, what will the environment be like for us? And what investors care about, basically 2 things. They care about returns, but they also care deeply about risk. And I think to be fair and to give this government credit, they understand how to increase the returns to investors. So corporate tax rates have been cut, subsidies are being given, protection is being given, banking system has been cleaned up. So they realize that, that you have to increase the returns to investors. But I think what they have been incapable of doing, which is because of their DNA and instincts, is to understand that you also have to reduce the risks for investors. That absolutely critical. And this is something that Tamil Nadu has realized very, very well. And that's why Tamil Nadu has done better than most other states in the world in being able to attract this investment. So if you turn on, ask me, this is all very airy-fairy, what is risk? Can you give me some examples of what we mean by, improving the risk environment? I would say there are 3 things, one of which Abhishek touched upon, but I'll come to that in a second. The first thing I would say is that, and I'm not making this up, I was once sitting here at Chennai airport last year. So this man came to me and said, sir, I read your piece somewhere, and what you said about the risks to private investment, I can tell you personally it applies to me. And what is that risk? That this government believes it should promote some national champions. I don't want to name names, but we all know that some groups are privileged. They get regulatory favors left, right, and center. And because of that, other investors, it's a kind of chilling effect on other investors. So this person who at the airport, and then I met also someone in New York, a global CEO, who said, love to come to India, but I will not get into a sector where any of these national champions are. Because I come in, I make my investment, and the rules will change against us in favor of these incumbents. And this has happened time and time and time again. It's even happened in the case of one of the big industries in Tamil Nadu. I will not name which industry it is, but that industry has suffered from the overbearing, oversized presence of one of these national champions. So this is promoting some big national champions can have a chilling effect on other investors, and that's one explanation for why private investment has come down. The second, and I think really very important, is that, if your attitude is going to be weaponize the state to go after particular individuals or groups or whatever, then it's going to affect private investment as well, because private investors will also feel, whether the number of tax demands that have gone up, in the last few years, what we used to call tax terrorism, some of it has been legitimized by the GST. So just investors feel very, very exposed by this, the weaponization of the enforcement directorate, the state, tax authorities, etc. And so the level playing field is not level. There can be arbitrary action, rules can be changed, retroactive taxation can be imposed. India has withdrawn from all bilateral investment treaties, so foreign investors are not sure whether. So it's a series of things like this. And, does the government recognize this? I don't know. The point is that these are all things that are intrinsic to the way it deals with the broader political issues. So therefore, some of it also spills over into the economic arena. And I think that also is very damaging. The third thing is what Abhishek said. Look, the great statesman of Tamil Nadu, economic statesman, Rajaji is famous for having coined the term license, quota, permit, Raj. I thought after 91, we would head in the direction of getting away from the license, quota, permit, Raj. And indeed we were. Slowly but steadily, we were moving away. You know, by no means perfect. In fact, this year's economic survey, my successor, very nice, stuff on deregulation and all of that. So it hasn't by no means gone away, but we were moving in the right direction. But I think this government intrinsically does not believe in openness. I think the notion that, in order to become a global exporting power, we're 2%, we need to get to 5-10%. If you want to be internationally competitive, you have to be more open. I think that's something that I think we don't get. But the kind of stuff that Abhishek was pointing out, these quality control orders that have come in, it is the worst combination of turning inward as an objective, as an attitude, and using, it's a kind of bureaucrat's paradise. Because essentially what the quality control order is, that supposing we say leather must meet Indian standards. So by the way, this means that normally what happens is there are some international standards. If you meet international standards, you come in. But we've said, no, we have to meet Indian standards. Now, how is someone going to meet that? Some Indian bureaucrat has to go to foreign factories to, certify this. And the kind of misuse and abuse that this lends itself to. I'll give you two examples. One is, you don't go abroad. You say, too busy, so imports can't come in. Or you say, I'll go after 10 months, 5 months, whatever. Then you say, no, I'll go to Indonesia, but not to China. Or even more, you can say, if some very prominent industrialist says, no, certify this because I'm getting imports from here and not from there, that abuse can also happen. So I think that, this is a very, very tricky global environment. I think we really need to, can't afford to kind of make mistakes and inflict all these self-goals on ourselves. And therefore, whether, we'll be able to solve our structural problems in this absolute tumultuous global environment with Mr. Trump, imposing tariffs left, right, and center on everyone. I really feel quite anxious and concerned whether we will be able to do so. Let me stop and hand it over to you, Bhanu.
Thank you, Arvind. There's a lot of issues for discussions, as always. Well, may I now invite Professor Bhanumurthy to offer his comments. Over to you.
Thank you, Suresh. Let me thank MIDS for inviting me to this budget discussion. Last time I was there in this place, also budget discussion, and I think Professor T.N. Srinivasan was sitting here, so that was a very interesting discussion that we had. So let me congratulate Abhishek for that very interesting paper. Couple of things. I just only listened to you in the presentation, but there are a couple of things that I thought may be useful. One is that, the usage of words like cyclical and structural for Indian database, in my view, still premature. I still believe what Geeta Gopinath has written, the cycle is a trend. So I think what we see is more of a transitory movements around the trend in the Indian context than a clear structural versus cyclical thing. So that's one comment that I have. And the second is, I think clearly we do have political cycles. And you also compared between 2019 and 2014, but I think this time, there is a combination of political cycle as well as reversal of the fiscal stimulus. I think both are happening at the same time. So maybe that's one reason why you do see the word you use, the fiscal squeeze, is much larger than what we have seen in the past. And in terms of growth, I think many of us started talking about what is the potential growth of this country, the long-term potential growth. Whatever methodology, whatever the data that you use, right now the potential growth would be somewhere between 6.5 to 7%. So to that extent, 6.4% that is estimated for the current year, and next year 6.7 by RBI, but 6.3 to 6.8% by the government. I think that's still closer to potential growth. So the slowdown, the kind of words that we use, slow down, I think if you assume that potentially 6.5, I think that's not very far from that. If you assume potential of 8%, yeah, you can tell that we are slowing down. So, so the 5.4%, in my view, is more of an aberration. I think that's more to do with the political cycles, not only at the national level, but also at the many major states that we have seen some of the elections, like Maharashtra, Haryana, there have been elections. So I think those kind of things that would have really affected that slowdown, what we call. One small point, and the thing is, if somebody wants to refer this paper, I think you need to have a year for this. So I think that's missing, so maybe you can correct it. So that's a small thing. So let me come back to the budget issues. I think Arvind very nicely put that whole budget into context, both domestically as well as what's happening in the global world. And today morning I was looking at some statistics. For the past 10 days, one paper that is being downloaded very frequently is that a classic paper by Harry Johnson, 1953 paper. The title is Optimal Tariffs and Retaliation. So I think we are going back to that kind of a situation, and that shows that where the world is actually going from here. So we are actually talking about retaliations and its net impact on the countries which are actually retaliating, and the impact on the countries that is imposing tariffs. So we are in that kind of situation, which clearly says that out of the three engines that we have, that is consumption, investments, and the export, I think we need to almost switch off the export engine for some time. So what is left is only two engines, that is consumption and investment. So in this context, what would be our potential growth is something, by the way, potential growth is not a static number. So I think it is a dynamic concept. Unfortunately, in our textbooks, we always think potential growth is a static number, but I think it's a very, very dynamic concept depending on many conditions. I also like to broaden this discussion. I think Arvind already referred to that. We need to look at this budget in together with the economic survey that is presented one day before. And economic survey very clearly and multiple places talks about geo-economic fragmentation. And that is about the external world, and then it talks about deregulation. I think there are many places it talks about deregulation. What it means is that please switch off the export engine, and you actually, correct your domestic regulatory issues. So, and there are so many low-hanging issues that is being highlighted in the economic survey. Ultimately, what economic survey arguing is that growth is more micro as much as macro concept. I think there is many more micro foundations in the growth, and that needs to be addressed. And again, Arvind very eloquently presented those things. Why some states are doing better than other states actually comes back to those micro foundations, and I think that seems to be the focus of the economic survey. Coming to the budget, I guess, in fact, the economic survey points out that the growth would be somewhere between 6.3 to 6.8%, and I think RBI, after 1 week, it says it will be somewhere close to 6.7%. So on the upper side of what economic survey presents. Uh, if you look at budget, I mean, they talk about 4 engines. By the way, first time I found, I don't know what Arvind's view on this, the budget has a structure. This time around I found it talks about 4 engines, it talks about the fuel, it talks about the destination, it talks about guiding spirit. So in that sense, it is very easy to read document this time compared to the past. The past used to be really unstructured, so I thought this time it was a little more structured. So it talks about 4 engines. One, I think there are very, very common engines. What we talk about: agriculture, MSME, investments, and export. So, and she talks about fuel for these engines, the reforms that has been highlighted. Some of the reforms have been highlighted in the budget document. So let me highlight a couple of things. In terms of the consumption, I mean, private consumption, for a long time, many of our analysts kept on talking about declining private consumption. But I think once we have this first advance estimate, I think completely changed narration. So private consumption is actually not declining, but it is the other engine, which is the investment, that seems to be taking a hit. So in that context, what the finance minister has done has actually given a stimulus in terms of increasing the private consumption. 1 lakh crore is something, is the revenue foregone. It is almost like, transferring resources to the so-called middle class that we have said. But at the same time, one needs to really look at what is its multiplier impact on the overall GDP growth. And my own estimate says that, the tax multiplier is about minus 1.01 is something that is what I estimated some time back. So I think if that is the case, you would see little more than 1 lakh crore would be adding to the overall GDP going forward. In terms of the investments, I think government continues this capex strategy. I think this is the 4th year where we have seen 3+ percentage point allocation to capital expenditure. Although some of us have been arguing that it has to be coming down to 3% as per the original FRBM Act. I don't know, I think, Arvind, I am a very a big supporter of FRBM Act. I mean, I'll come to that later, why it is very important. I have seen your rejoinder, but I think I also written a rejoinder on that saying that you still have to come back to the original FRBM Act of 2003. I'll come to that, why I believe that. And I think the budget focuses on 3.1% capital expenditure. But if you look at the effective capital expenditure, where some of the resources has been transferred to as part of the grants in aid, it is actually 4.2% of the GDP. Like, right, for example, in the next financial year, and the effective revenue deficit is only 0.3%. So we're almost close to the original FRBM Act of 2003, where the trigger for the FRBM is basically bringing down the revenue deficit to 0, what we call it as the golden rule. So we are somewhere close to that, and I think that is a very positive thing in my view. In terms of other investment proposals, there are many other many small issues like increasing the credit under the Kisan credit card, MSMEs, exporters, and credit card to micro enterprises. So there are many other small micro policy changes that has been brought in. But in terms of the export side, I think there again, if you look at the finance minister, she speaks about almost a 2-page write-up on the export side. So there are so many issues like some of the non-tariff barriers also been talked about it. But one thing that most important I think in the export side is the reduction of tariffs. I think many people believe that tariff is more to do with imports, but I think, in my opinion, I think that tariffs are the major drivers of export, particularly when it comes to manufacturing sector. And empirically also, exports in India, particularly manufacturing exports, is increasingly driven by imports. I think that is the thing that we need to understand. So in my view, bringing down the tariffs is going to be positive for exports going forward. On the reforms, there are many reforms. I think there's a new what is that, direct tax code is going to be brought in tomorrow. There are also something related to financial sector. And we have seen increasing FDI in the insurance sector. So there are many other regulatory reforms that have been proposed. I'm not going to get into all those things. In terms of the macro fiscal framework, I think where I differ from many analysts is that it's in the original FRBM Act also, it is not the fiscal deficit alone is the target. We had 3 targets in the original FRBM Act. We had fiscal deficit, we had revenue deficit, and we also had a public debt to GDP ratio. So there are 3 targets, and 3 are internally consistent in my view. And that's one thing which has really helped us in the pre-global financial crisis. And somewhere down the line, I think following FRBM review committee in the 2018 finance bill, we dropped 1 out of the 3 targets. I think we dropped the revenue deficit. That is, in my view, is the growth retarding kind of a policy where you retain the fiscal deficit target as well as the public debt, then you drop the revenue deficit as a target from that whole FRBM original act. And also, I think I'm sure students are here, debt is a stock and deficit is a flow. You cannot actually target the debt, the stock component, without containing the flow concept. So in my view, I think public debt certainly is a target, but I think the instrument for that is basically the fiscal deficit as well as the revenue deficit in my view. And if you look at the budget document, there are 3 graphs have been presented at the end where they have given different scenarios, and they suggest that public debt to GDP ratio should be brought down to 50% plus or minus 1% by the end of 16th Finance Commission period. And one can always derive, you can always do the back calculation and you can estimate what would be the fiscal deficit number. But I think fiscal policy is just one part of the story when we talk about macro stability. I think there is also a monetary policy. In fact, as Abhishek very clearly mentioned, monetary policy is also equal partner in the growth, the macro stability. So the whole distribution of nominal GDP growth between real GDP growth and inflation is the macro monetary fiscal strategy that we need to focus. In this context, like for example, they assume 10% is the nominal GDP growth. The distribution of 10% between real GDP growth and inflation is a major challenge in my view. And for that, you need to derive, as I said, we can really derive the fiscal deficit number from those simulations that has been present in the budget. But I think within the fiscal deficit, what is the capex and what is the revenue deficit is, I think that's more important than just getting the headline fiscal deficit. So the nominal GDP growth equal to real GDP growth plus inflation is a mirror image of fiscal deficit is equal to revenue deficit plus capital expenditure. So they are related. So in that context, somehow, for some reason, we don't really bring the revenue deficit as a policy measure. So in my view, the revenue deficit will be much more serious variable than the headline fiscal deficit number. And one last point, one of the highlights of the last 4 or 5 years budget is the fiscal transparency. Okay, I think that is certainly one thing that I'm sure even the critics would agree with that. There is a nice graph at the end of the statement where they put up a graph where the relation between change in the liabilities and the fiscal deficit. And you get a ratio of almost equal to 1. That means there is no off-budget liabilities that is disturbing this particular identity where the change in the public debt should be equal to the borrowing of that particular year. In fact, if you want to understand what is that it looks like if there is a off-budget liabilities, you will see in the same graph 3 years before, you would have seen the ratio is much more than 1. So I think that credit should really go to the finance minister, and I'll be happy even that kind of graphs are derived for the state governments also. I mean, you don't get that kind of a neat graphs. So in that context, the fiscal transparency is certainly a hallmark of the last 4 or 5 budgets. And there are a couple of things, I'll take it up and I'll stop there. I think one of the areas where I'm little disappointed is there's little less clarity on the overall disinvestment process. Of course, somebody asked the finance minister in the press conference, but I guess the kind of numbers, the information that we are getting from the budget, I think there is a reduced focus on disinvestment overall, and I think they propose something what is called asset monetization 2.0, where by next 5 years you have to generate something like 10 lakh crore. That means on an average 2 lakh crore per annum is going to be extremely challenging in given the current context. And another really last point, if you look at the market borrowing program, again, see, the fiscal policy is not independent of the monetary policy. I think this is where the two things that really work together is where when it comes to the market borrowing program. The market borrowing program for the next year is actually projected as lower than the current year. This is the first time, I think, in my view, where the next year market borrowing program is pegged at lower than the previous year. I think that is certainly one good news for the monetary policy, and I do hope that the kind of coordination that we have seen between the fiscal and monetary policies will continue for the next year, so in the coming years also, so that you will still have a much better macro stability in the country, despite the kind of headwinds that we are facing from the external environment. Arvind, you talked about the personal income tax. I don't know whether you have seen Sujit Barla's article, who argues that India is one country where the ratio of personal income tax to the total taxes is much higher than any other comparable countries in the world. So I don't know what is your comment, but I just thought I will raise this particular issue. So already the share of personal income tax in India is much higher compared to any other comparable emerging market economies. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Vanamurthy. I think I would now open the floor for discussions. Mainly questions, comments we can take up towards the end, especially if it is a longer comment. So I would request you to be brief and pointed. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Ritaj Sharma. I'm a master's student at the Madras School of Economics. I have 2 short questions. My first is to Mr. Anand. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Now, you mentioned that India could feasibly grow, take up the space that China has vacated in the low-skill export market. Now, one question I have is that the low-skill export market in terms of services is likely to shrink because of the growth of AI. And additionally, in terms of manufacturing, you have growth in the spheres of robotics, which are less spoken about as compared to AI, but are still very much present. So the general low-skill market is going to decrease, and that's possibly a reason why China has chosen to upskill significantly. So does that change your prediction, or is that something that we don't need to worry about so much? My second question is a very general question, which is that I think we've also spoken about this, that consumption has not gone down particularly. That's something that you can also justify from CPHS or any other source like that. So why do you feel that consumption isn't going down while we also have volatile and non-decreasing inflation? Is that a behavioral change? Is that something related to the level of autonomous consumption not increasing? That's all. Thank you.
We'll collect more questions and then maybe. No?
Okay, Abhishek, then I think then you can react to this, and then maybe by the time people might have more time to think on questions.
Yeah, so the numbers that I showed you, we don't look at services there, although that is important and India does pretty well when it comes to services, but we were strictly focusing on manufacturing and low skill manufacturing. Now typically what are the industries that will fall, or we categorize as low skill manufacturing, say apparel, textile, leather, footwear, where all the AI related issues that you have talked about, I mean, at least in the near future, I mean, we don't feel that the industry is going to really hampered by the growth of AI. Certainly in services, yes, and India has to think about, while China is doing, nobody thought that China will do when it comes to services and they're developing AI tools. Everyone thought India certainly will do better, but we haven't been able to do that, and we haven't developed our own AI tools. But this was more about apparel, textile, leather, footwear, where there is sizable space right now, and you do see it in numbers. China is declining, but it's not that overall low skill industry is declining. If you look at their share in exports over as a proportion of total, it's just that other countries has picked up that space and India has not been able to do that. So yes, I mean, AI, all of these could become potentially a threat in future, but in near future, at least I don't feel that we need to worry about, and there is enough scope for India to gain from China vacating that space.
Just to add to what Abhishek said, I mean, look, there is no doubt that if one unit of rupee of apparel exports was creating 10 employment today, in the future it'll be 9, 8, 7, 6. That's inevitable, right? So that is going to happen. Maybe not, we don't know the pace. Some of it's already happening because, for example, as you rightly said, robots can cut soft cloth now. So in apparel, therefore they displace. But you see, but the point is that we have, say, 3% global export market share. Just do simple arithmetic, right? Supposing we went to 10 and then said, but the employment potential will only be half. It's still very big in a way that you cannot get from, any engine of growth. So that's why I think even though this is going to become less and less employment intensive going forward, it's certainly going to be more employment generating than services exports, for example, right? And so that's why we need to focus on that. On your second question, I'm going to be slightly facetious, but I'm deadly serious. The answer is that I don't understand any of the numbers from the Indian national income accounts. Consumption goes up, consumption comes down, GDP is 7, consumption is 3. I don't understand any GDP number anymore. So when you talk about 6% potential growth, I mean, let me embarrass Bhanu here. I'm going to embarrass Bhanu. So, sorry, Bhanu. I am going to embarrass. See, of course, I've been associated with saying that post 2011, the India's GDP numbers are, I don't understand them. I think they're overstated. But just to be slightly nationalistic here, if I don't understand our GDP numbers, I don't understand China's GDP numbers or the population numbers. So they are, one step ahead of us in the data that they generate or they don't generate. So anyway, so post 2011, I said the numbers I don't understand. They're probably overstated. But what people don't realize is that between 2004 and 2011, there used to be a number. And that number was, let's say, growth of, let's say, about 7.5%. Okay? This government appointed a commission. Who was one of the very esteemed members of that commission? Bhanu. Bhanu's committee said, no, it's not 7.5%. It's actually +1, roughly. It should be 8.5%. And very carefully done and a very impressive piece of work. Bhanu and Sudipto Mandal and others. So original estimate was 7.5%. They said it should be 8.5%. The government revised it to 6%. Huh? Yeah, correct. Or maybe, but so you know, India is one of those countries where, you know, there's a very famous paper in the Journal of Political Economy which says that autocratic governments tend to overstate GDP growth. You must have seen that paper, right? But the beauty of our thing is that, so whereas I felt that 2011 was overstated, but you know, we also understate when necessary our growth as well. And the reasons for the understating before was, of course, to make the post 2014 performance look much better. So we have so I often say that Arthur C. Clarke, you know, the famous, you know, the 2001 Space Odyssey, the space writer, science fiction writer, he had a very nice saying which said that every sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I say the Indian GDP thing is that technology also. Yeah, I'm done. I'll come back to your thing maybe in the second round.
No, I think on the GDP, you know what, there are two committees. I think in both the committees I was there, so.
You can't get out of it, Banu.
Yes, yeah. So what we have said, I mean, the committee the committee outcome was that if you look at the back series, I mean, from when you create a back series for the new base year, that is 2011-12, unfortunately the NSO or CSO, they had not produced the back series when they changed the methodology. So we've been asked to create estimate a back series. Now, in the back series, in terms of the nominal GDP, there is no difference between the previous estimates and our estimates. So
Correct.
yeah. So
But the real there is.
when the real, there is a difference because you are using the CPI numbers. Okay. So when you use the CPI numbers, you get a different growth. When you use the WPI number, you get a different growth. So ultimately, it was left to the National Statistical Commission to choose one of them, whichever they feel it is robust. It was comparable. So post 2011, we used more of a CPI numbers, and I think they found that that is more consistent compared to the WPI-based GDP estimation. So, and the difference is not that much, as you said, 7.5 to 8.5. No, it was, the difference is only 0.3% between the two estimates.
No,
Yeah.
Banu, so Banu's kind of being very diplomatic here.
No, it is there in the public domain. It is there in the
yeah,
public.
you should read the public domain.
Yes.
So they have it's not worth going to, but basically, but when the backcasting was finally done, it was so essentially the old number was here, you were here, but they were here. That's the essential thing.
No, I was there in all the three. Don't worry.
No. I'm talking about the numbers. That's. But Banu's
So,
being very
as I said, I was there in all the three. So.
Yeah, Professor Arun.
Slightly different question from this. No? In India, we have seen a wave in the 90s and early 2000s, the IT wave, which created a lot of employment, growth, and everything. In China, we have seen the manufacturing wave. Though we don't know much about it. What do you think should be the sector? Where do you think the growth is going to come from in the future? Because there has to be some kind of a wave, what we saw in the IT and ITES sector, something similar to that to really push the growth and employment and so on and so forth. So since you've been at the helm of affairs, so I thought maybe you could throw some light on what could be the sector, manufacturing, automobile, or IT, ITES services, whatever. I don't know. I thought I'd just check with you.
Having been at the helm doesn't make me any better qualified to predict the future, as you know. No, I think broadly what you were saying is that whatever is going to be the wave, it's going to be certainly labor displacing in some sense of the term. I think that's a given. To me, the question is not what is going to come, right? But how should you be prepared for uncertainty? Because we don't know what's going to come, right? Uncertainty. Now, my own view is that if the next wave or whatever is going to be very, very high-skilled intensive, right? Then one policy conclusion would be we must beef up our, the higher education, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that if you say policy should focus on that, that's almost a recipe for abandoning a vast majority of the labor force. See, that's the dilemma we face, right? Even if the trend is going to be more, there is still a window for exploiting labor-intensive manufacturing. That window is not going to remain forever, but it's a small window. It's going to be not as big as the thing, but we have to try our best to do that. And Tamil Nadu is a very good example. You see, what is particularly interesting about Tamil Nadu is this. So if you take Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, right? It's exactly, Karnataka is services, Tamil Nadu is manufacturing more than service. We also do a bit of services. Of course, if we had more alcohol options, maybe we will get more services here as well for the young, but we don't have that. But what Tamil Nadu has done, because there's a real fundamental puzzle about this, which people don't realize, which is that why is Tamil Nadu, by the way, which is in India, wages in India are probably amongst the highest in Tamil Nadu compared to everywhere else. And yet the manufacturing is coming to Tamil Nadu. Why is that? So part of it is because the good things that, both governments have done, then people, I know the obvious question will come, what about corruption and all this? We'll come to that in a second. But they both, bipartisan, we've had a very good environment which reassures investors. But I think what the really interesting that's happened in Tamil Nadu is that basically there are three pools of labor in Tamil Nadu. One is the male pool, which is high wages. That is not competitive to attract manufacturing. But we have two other pools, which is what is sustaining this manufacturing, which is women. So in electronics, Foxconn, Tata, all the leather footwear, 80%, 90% labor, and their wages are lower. So that's why we get that. The second pool is migrant labor. You see, so I think in that sense, Tamil Nadu, it's provided the environment, and then it's got, despite its high wages, it's managed to actually create cheaper pools of labor by doing this. So it's like but it's going to run out. There's going to be limits to this because the wages are going to get higher. So that's why, this model has to travel elsewhere. That's a very long-winded way of saying that the future is going to be more high-skill based thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should gear our policies, where the government puts in its effort just to be able to capitalize on that. Because it's non-inclusive. People in the room, 5% of the labor force will benefit, and that would be a travesty. Yeah, there's a question from there.
Happy evening. I'm Arvind from Madras School of Economics. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. When we look into numbers, we said that India is not caring about the risk environment for the FDI to flow in. But then the recent report from the UN suggests that while FDI is falling by 2% throughout the globe for developing economics, developing economies, China saw a 29% drop, but then India has seen a 13% increase in FDI. So do you think that the fall in private investment is more of a geopolitically hyped up scenario rather than just an Indian-centric thing?
Abhishek, you have to answer to that.
So what we show in the chart that you saw is, yes, because of geopolitical issues, but also, what is happening globally, high interest rates in US. So there is capital outflow, FDI, which used to come to emerging economies. Part of it is going back to the US because, economy is doing well, whereas other countries not doing as well. But even accounting for that, so that explains part of the slowdown that we see in India. But even accounting for that, if you exclude, US, or say, some other countries which have, developed countries which have attracted capital after US, India's share in overall, inflow, overall FDI, it has gone down, and that cannot be explained by any geopolitical or global factors. That has to do with India-specific factors. After all, why other countries, even if the pool of FDI is declining, other countries have been able to attract as much as they could earlier, but India has not been able to do that. So that cannot be explained by global factors. So we have to distinguish between, yes, global factors, India cannot do much about it, but that only explains maybe around, if we did calculate some of the numbers as well, so maybe 40% of the decline as a share of GDP. That can be explained by global factors, but 60% of the decline it has to do with domestic factors.
Yeah, one more there.
Good evening. So my questions are based on the budget. So the first one is, given the recent Trump announcements and all, there's a growing risk of moving the money out of the emerging markets. So, and even the consumption pattern in India has been falling down in the recent years. So is the recent tax cuts that are aimed, that are said to be a reward for honest taxpayers, is it an attempt to offset this move? This could cause a breakdown in a market like India? And I think another question I have is, I think one of the questions based on the the presentation, I think one of the things which I saw was there's a growing, I think the presentation said that the investors' growing disbelief in the market, Indian market is reducing. However, there's a growing incidence of GCCs in India as well, Global Capability Centers. It's been a rise for the last few years. So how does that work out? And then, there's also regarding tariffs, import tariffs and all. The budget, the recent budget, they have introduced cuts in tariffs and all. Is this, are they taking a break from Atmanirbhar mission, or? Thank you.
Yeah, and the tariffs, I think if you look at post-reform period, from post-1991, one of the major reforms happened on the trade side, apart from that exchange rate devaluation and other things, is bringing down the tariffs from whatever percentage, 300 or 400% to less than 10%. So that is the major reform that happened on the trade side, and it has actually helped India to position itself in the international market. So if you look at the empirics also, as I said in my own intervention, since you are a student of economics, you try to estimate a small export demand function. Okay? Now you will see whether tariffs has any role in that. So in my own study says that tariffs has a much larger impact on the exports, especially when it comes to manufacturing sector. Now that is what has helped India to add that additional 2 percentage point in the potential growth in the pre-global financial crisis period. So after that, I think in the recent period, we have seen more commodities brought into the tariff lines, and I think many of the economists, including the government, started criticizing that that is not the way to go if you want to really increase your exports and all. So I think, but I'm not really sure whether the tariffs is consistent with, first of all, I don't know what is Atmanirbhar Bharat, so I don't know what it is. But second is the tariffs in the long run is nothing. Import tariffs are nothing but export tax. So in that sense, it doesn't really help to expand your trade with other countries. So they brought down. I don't know whether it is because of the Prime Minister's visit to US today, but it's still been brought down.
No, just on the GCC part that you raised. So basically, I mean, both are true. So our FDI, whatever we are attracting, that is slowing down. India, if you look at last, post-independence, we do relatively better when it comes to services and high-tech manufacturing, not low-tech manufacturing. So yes, FDI that we are attracting, it has gone down substantially, but we have managed to still attract. So within that limited pool that we are attracting, it's heavily towards services, GCC that you are seeing. So many of them, they came. So our services exports post pandemic, it really, we did well. But even that you would see now, services exports, it is slowing down. So it's no longer true that we continue to do well. There was a short-term boom, a lot of GCC, FDI, whatever FDI we kind of attracted was more geared towards services and high-tech manufacturing. And we did well for some quarters when it comes to services exports. But you do see now it is stabilizing. In fact, it is coming down. So finally, even you would see in future quarters that those numbers are coming down as well.
Sir, Arvind, so you said the 100,000 crores loss in income tax, right? Like that's the projected loss in income tax. But like, should I be even concerned about it? Because if your GST is stabilizing at 1.75 lakh crores a month, then you're just talking about like 15 days of GST. And even if this 100,000 is there, if you're going to take 18% of that, that's like almost, essentially it's only 15 days of GST. That's just one question, the way I see it at least. The second question is that, should we be targeting these clothing, cloth expo? See, Temu and Shein has just flooded, fast fashion has flooded the US. This is like 60, each American is using 68 pieces of clothing, purchasing 68 pieces of clothing per year. I mean, you don't want to purchase, should we even be chasing that as a policy? On the other hand, because I'm just talking global environmental concerns. It's just 68 pieces of clothing per year per capita is the number in the US. It's just a real number. You can look it up in any fast fashion it's not a moral argument, it's an environmental argument. Yeah, so and why do we have to chase that as a growth when the country consumption, say fuel consumption, if you want to target, they are able to do that simply because of the dollar exchange rate, right? Okay, strength of economy and stuff, but like chasing the fuel outflow from India, if you here in MIDS there was a talk where they showed that if you target the high consumption vehicles, you can very quickly bring down the import bill, fuel import bill, very quickly, and that lies in your argument as to bringing down the slow decline in the capital outflow from the country. The third thing about to Banu Murthy is that in terms of consumption patterns, I still don't have like graphs for the GST. In the GST market split, I want to see what exactly is growing. Is it the restaurants consumption which is growing? Is it Swiggy delivery which is growing as a percentage of GST? Personally, I have not seen the breakdown of the splits of that to to track this consumption?
Versus GST 1.7 lakh. No, no, take the GST part of it. Even the first one? Go ahead. So I think that, you know, raising, so the government gives up 1 lakh crore, right? I mean, raising that amount is not easy. So to say that, you know, that it's only whatever is, you have to have the confidence that you can actually make up for that, you know, through other taxes. And, you know, I don't know whether that's doable or not. So therefore what I'm saying is that, so when you give that tax cut, it has to be because you think it's going to serve some objective like reviving consumption or growth or whatever. So that, and that, you know, Bhanu has spoken to that. But to say that, you know, it's not, all I'm saying, it's not a small sum of money. 1 lakh crore, raising 1 lakh crore is pretty difficult, and we have to be mindful. On your second point, you know, I don't want to, these are all very tricky subjects. You know, I care about, you know, if I were a policy maker, you know, if I can create jobs in India by exporting apparel, that would be my target. You know, I'm, you know, or put it this way, in my concentric circle of priorities, you know, US consumption patterns, impact on the environment are going to be subservient to my desire to create jobs in India. And, you know, so I would, you know, very much want to make sure that why is Temu doing it? I would rather have Indian exporters do that and create jobs everywhere in India. On the third one, Bhanu will know better, but it's a good question.
Yeah, I think on the GST, right? I mean, you asked about the
yeah, the breakdown.
Yeah, I think that is, I don't think we have the disaggregated data with regard to commodities and all those things, particularly some of the important commodities that you were talking about. But I think at a state level, there is some data available. Maybe one can look at those numbers, but otherwise, until unless we don't, in fact, this is one of the big challenges in the national accounts. We thought that, you know, once you get the GST numbers, you know, it will be very useful for you to predict quarterly GDP numbers much better, but we don't get those data from the GST Council. So it's a big challenge.
But it's a very good question, by the way. It's a very good point.
Yeah.
Because we should be, both nationally and at the state level, be routinely producing these kind of disaggregated numbers. And my big point now is, when we revise our GDP numbers and our things, we should be making use of this GST extensively, because it's fantastic data, it's timely, it's frequent, you know, and, you know, everyone has access to it, and we should be able to use that. But it's a very good point. I think we should, and we should have done this long ago, you know. But
no, by the way, this is what one of our recommendations in the previous report.
That's true. By the way, one important point I want to reinforce what Bhanu said is the point on fiscal transparency, that the government has done a very good job of actually last 3-4 budgets, I think for that, and they've maintained it in this budget. So just to want to, on the record, say that the government deserves a lot of credit for that, and Bhanu was very right in pointing that out.
So my question is on the growth of the manufacturing sector. So as Sir told that China is moving away from the labor-intensive industry, especially the textile producing industry, and so there is a gap created in that sector. So many countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh are coming forward and, you know, producing more there and exporting more there. But there are some problems that have risen due to that. In Bangladesh especially, we hear that there are sweatshop factories and, like, you know, exploitation of labor occurring. So my question is, hence there is a lot of production there. So my question is, how does India like counter with that, or how does it get a competitive edge over that?
So your point about Bangladesh is true. I mean, of course, you know, they have done very well because of right policy measures. I mean, for example, incentivizing exports. So if you export a lot, whatever costs you had to incur, if you were importing all the key intermediary, you could get it reimbursed. So even if there is, in principle, there is a high tariff rate, but then if you are an exporter, you virtually pay zero tariff. That's one. Second, they have also been beneficiary of the fact that low income countries, so you have market access to US, which India doesn't have. Plus, they are also part of some trade deals. So those are primarily the reasons why they have been able to do well. But yes, I mean, concerns about labor regulations, wages being low. I mean, I think they strictly pay very low wages, which also helps them. But despite that, I mean, even if you concede that, I mean, I think they have other policy measures in place because of which. It's not just because, regulatory concerns, this and that. Because in China, in Bangladesh, you have all these like H&M, Zara, they have big factories there and they make sure that they adhere to all the norms that should be. And they are the ones who are big exporters. At the same time, you have small manufacturers who perhaps bypass all those rules and regulations. So Bangladesh story, you cannot say it's only because they bypass all the regulatory concerns. And I mean, India has many lessons to learn from how Bangladesh has done it, and Vietnam as well.
Just to add, I had a long discussion with the industries minister today, Mr. Raja, and I think what we were discussing is that, and I should have said this earlier, that India and Tamil Nadu now not only has a China +1 opportunity, but a Vietnam +1 and a Bangladesh +1 opportunity as well. Because, as you know, because of the tumult in Bangladesh, and that's why your question becomes very relevant, and what Abhishek said is exactly right. I would just add that, the danger that there will be similar exploitation or the possibility of that, I think is fairly low in India because, we are a democratic country, we have reasonably, labor, and, even now in Tamil Nadu there's a strike, going on. So, by and large, I feel that labor protections in India, are not going to be, are reasonably strong. And so those kinds of, problems are not going to be India's problems. The last controversial thing I would say is that, look, in Bangladesh, now of course Bangladesh is going through troubled times, but it is one of the best examples in the world, all of take development experience more broadly, where because of this labor-intensive, female labor-intensive manufacturing, maybe some of it happened with exploitation, etc. We can discuss that, it's not nice. But the impact on women and social development, raising the age of marriage, enrollment in female enrollment, gender parity, has just kind of been absolutely transformational, was transformational. So when we evaluate these things, we should keep the broader achievements in mind as well. I'm not saying one should not be conscious of the possibilities of exploitation, but there's also, the much bigger achievements that happen. I'm not saying they justify whatever might have happened, but we have to have a slightly historical perspective on this. Bangladeshi society in particular, the impact on women because of manufacturing and garments, absolutely transformational.
I think we will close this session.
We've overrun by...
That's okay. May I request Prasanna to say the vote of thanks?
Thank you, gentlemen, for the enlightening discussion and for your questions. Before we conclude, may I now invite Professor C. Selvaraj, the chairperson of MNDA Trust, to hand over a small memento on behalf of MIDS and the Trust to our chief guests. Dr. Arvind Subramanian and Professor Bhanumurthy. Thank you, Professor. I'd now like to take a moment for a brief vote of thanks. The Madras Institute of Development Studies conveys its gratitude to the Malcolm and Elizabeth Oyes Asia Trust, whose role is central in getting this budget discussion event up and running. MIDS and MNDA Trust would like to thank Dr. Arvind Subramanian for finding time for us in his busy schedule, and Professor Bhanumurthy for accepting our invite at such a short notice, and to Mr. Abhishek for making this wonderful presentation. We thank them for making this budget discussion enlightening and instructive. MIDS intends to organize a follow-up event later this year called Mid-Year Review of Economy, something the MIDS founder, Malcolm Oyes Asia, used to do in his days. I'd like to conclude by thanking my colleagues in the administration and IT sections for their support. We'd like to thank everyone in the audience and members of the press for joining us today. Good night and good luck. Thank you.